Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the National Network of Credit and Financial Professionals. I am here today with Raphael Zeraldin and Jonathan Zimmerman from Elliott Greenleaf, who will be presenting on OFAC Compliance. A few items to get out of the way before we begin. If you have any questions during the course of the presentation, you can ask them through the questions function on your side panel. We will gather all those questions and save them for a Q&A at the end of the presentation. If you are looking for a copy of the slides to follow along today, they are available through the handout section in your side panel. We will also be sending a copy through email after the presentation is complete. The last item is that we will have a brief survey that pops up after the webinar ends. It only takes about 30 seconds to fill out, but it gives us a lot of great information on how we can continue to make our webinars better for you. Now, Ken Frisco will give you a brief intro of our speakers.
Thanks, Sharon. Our speaker, Raphael Zeraldin, is a shareholder, director, and Elliott Greenleaf chair of the Commercial Bankruptcy and Restructuring Department. He is a business lawyer who concentrates his practice in the areas of commercial bankruptcy and restructuring, commercial litigation, creditors' rights, corporate law and entity formation, international and comparative law, corporate compliance, and related regulations, including under the Federal Corrupt Practices Act, commercial transactions, and cyber law. He leads the firm's representation as Special Litigation Counsel to statutory committees and debtors. He has a BS degree in architecture from the University of Virginia and a JD degree from Widener University School of Law, where he served as an articles editor for the Law Review and was published as a law student. He's also a member of the National Association of Corporate Directors and an NACD Fellow, a 2015 Legal Counsel on Legal Diversity Fellow, and a Fellow of the American Bar Foundation. I'd like to now turn the presentation back to Raphael and Jonathan to begin our webinar.
So, only because I send them all kinds of money each year, you forgot my Georgetown LLM, but go Hoyas. So let's start off with who really kind of manages the Office of Foreign Assets Control and what OFAC is. John, can you take us through the Office of Foreign Assets Control and tell us a little bit about what they do and what their role is in Treasury? Because we'll find out there's a bunch of different folks that regulate a lot of these export controls, but OFAC is one of the biggest.
Sure. So, as Raphael mentioned, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which we'll just call OFAC throughout the presentation, is part of the Treasury Department, and it is responsible for administering and enforcing economic and trade sanctions based on the U.S. foreign policy and national security goals. Some of what they do relates to certain targeted foreign countries and regimes, certain terrorist organizations, international narcotics traffickers, people engaged in activities related to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, as well as other threats to U.S. national security, U.S. foreign policy, as well as the economy of the United States.
Basically all the bad guys, right, John?
Correct. All the James Bond villains in the world.
Right.
The authority for OFAC comes under the President's national emergency powers, as well as there's specific legislation and regulations that they use to impose controls on certain transactions, as well as freezing assets under U.S. jurisdiction. And a lot of what they do, and we'll get into it, relates to financial assets. Certain of the sanctions are based on agreements with the United Nations and other international mandates, which are multilateral, multinational in scope, and they involve cooperation with our allies as well as other governments around the world.
And look, you got to be careful as well, because one of the things you say, okay, well, they got all this power, they're supposed to go after the bad guys. What kind of tools do they have with them? And OFAC with Treasury, they have MOUs with all the other bank regulators that are out there. So they've got a pretty wide net to be able to detect anything that looks like money laundering or any sort of other trigger out there that is going to implicate one of the export controls. There's some restrictions to that, but as you know, particularly post 9/11 and with the things that are going on in the world, they've got a lot of leeway. So, John, why don't we go to the next slide?
Sure.
And there's other folks that are out there too, in addition to Treasury. You've got a variety of other, but the other big important one is really the Department of Commerce. And the Department of Commerce is going to administer export administration regulations, and the Department of State is going to deal with the international traffic in arms regulations. So, you're looking at primarily Commerce, State, and Treasury, but there are a ton of other agencies that have regulations that maybe mirror or incorporate or cross-reference all of these. We can go to the next slide, Sean. So, John, why don't you take us through which section is the big section in Commerce, and what do they enforce?
Sure. So, inside the Commerce Department, the main section that it helps enforce these regulations is the Bureau of Industry and Security. It is not only a licensing and regulatory agency, but is also an enforcement agency that really tries to ensure effective export control and treaty compliance, and it helps with the continued U.S. strategic technology leadership, as well as a strong defense industrial base. The main thing that the Bureau of Industry and Security does is administers and enforces what is called the Export Administration Regulations, otherwise known as EAR or EAR, which regulate the export and re-export of commercial commodities and technology, as well as less sensitive military items. So with respect to the Export Administration Regulations, it comes from the Export Administration Act of 1979, which allowed the President to regulate exports of civilian goods and technologies, such as equipment, materials, software, and technology, including, and this is important, data and know-how that have military applications. And these are sometimes called dual-use items. A relatively recent example of that was when the PlayStation 4 came out. The microchip inside the PlayStation 4 is so powerful that it can be used in guided weapon systems. And so the export and sale of that was actually something that the BIS had to take a look at. And there's all sorts of other dual-use items that are out there as well.
Right, and the big thing is the Commerce Control List is the list of stuff that, as we'll get into it, is heavily regulated. So that's another key item to kind of remember. If you're taking notes at your desk or wherever you're traveling, the Commerce Control List is a big deal, and that and a bunch of other lists are the things you have to kind of be aware of when you're looking at a transaction as a credit manager. One of the other areas that are touched on here, it may not touch on everything, but as Jonathan just laid out, it may be some sort of chip. Everything's done by computers, and the technology is integrated into a lot of things, including weapons. So you have to be careful that something you're using can't be thrown into one of these other regulations for the stuff that's a little bit more overtly a munition. But there's a munition list which has restricted articles and services, and in order, if you're on this munitions list that's in the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, you need an export license, and you got 21 categories on this list, and the Department of State is responsible for controlling the influx of any of these items. John, we can go to the next slide. And you've got, again, the EAR and the ITAR. And again, the ITAR is going to cover things that are pretty overtly military items or defense articles. Anything that can be designed to kill or defend against death in a military setting is kind of the big definition. There's space-related technology here because of the applications of missile technology. And it's also technical data is included here. And there's a strict regulatory licensing of any of these items. Doesn't talk about research or commercial objectives. This is something that's strictly controlled. The EAR, on the other hand, just to kind of compare them side by side, this is for anything that's designed for a commercial purpose but could have a military application. It covers both the goods and the tech, and licensing under the EAR addresses, kind of balancing, making sure we're protected and also making sure the commerce flows. This combines commercial and research objectives with national security objectives, and as we'll see, it does impose some requirements, some explicit requirements on anyone who might be able to give a tip-off to any of these regulators. So, John, go to the next one. John, why don't you take them through the parade of bad things that can happen if you violate it?
Sure.
We always try to set up our presentations this way. We'll kind of lay out who's out there and kind of the what, and then we'll tell you why you should be paying attention to it by showing you the penalties that are available to the government in these situations.
Yeah, so under both ITAR as well as EAR, there's the potential for substantial penalties, both civil and criminal. Usually it's, especially with EAR, it's more on the civil side, but in particularly egregious situations, and especially when you're dealing with arms trafficking, there can be serious criminal penalties as well that actually do take place. So, for example, with ITAR, the civil fines can reach as high as $5,000 per violation, and that can really add up, as well as criminal penalties up to $1 million per violation, as well as 10 years imprisonment per violation. Under EAR, it's a little bit less, but generally the volume that gets dealt with means that these add up to pretty big numbers, as you'll see in a little bit. The maximum civil fines can reach up to $250,000 per violation. Criminal penalties, just as under ITAR, are about $1 million per violation, but actually up to 20 years as opposed to 10 years under ITAR for 20 years imprisonment per violation under EAR. And some relatively recent examples of sanctions that have taken place through OFAC, and these also give you an idea of the different types of activities that can lead to sanctions. Generally, when sanctions have been imposed, they've been imposed on banks and other financial institutions. But in one example, it was AIG. They paid $148,000 to settle potential liability for what was called 555 apparent violations of OFAC sanctions. And what they got in trouble for was ensuring maritime shipments of various goods and materials that were either destined for or went through some companies that were on the prohibited lists, including Iran, Sudan, and Cuba, or that involved a black person. And we'll get into some of those terms in a little bit. As another example was United Medical Instruments, which paid a little bit over $500,000 to settle allegations that it made sales of medical imaging equipment with the knowledge or reason to know, and those are going to be important terms as well, that the goods were intended specifically for either supply or re-exportation to purchasers located in Iran, and it did so by facilitating the sales of this equipment through a company located in the UAE. And again, the important thing to note here is it's knew or should have known. And so when we're talking about compliance, we'll talk about how to set up things so that will help you to either know about something or give you some red flags to help you investigate things further. In 2017, there have been approximately one settlement per month. And when I go to the next, you can see these are relatively low dollar amounts until you get to the $12 million one. But then when we go to the next slide, you'll see the one that stands out on March 7th is for over $100 million. And in that particular one, this was what OFAC called a particularly egregious case. It was a Delaware corporation that facilitated the sale of goods to Iran by specifically setting up third-party companies in order to get these goods into Iran, and it was the highest levels of the company that knew that this was taking place. And so OFAC came down on these guys really hard. And again, when we start talking about penalties per violation and how it can add up, we're talking over $100 million in civil penalties.
So we've kind of told you who the bad guys are, what we have to watch out for, who the regulators are, and what can happen if you are involved in a violation, and what parts of the government help to execute this, and some of the basic ideas of licensing, etc. So one of the things kind of we'll get into is in order to really have a good compliance program or understand your responsibilities under compliance, you got to understand exemptions, licensing, and monitoring. So go to the next one, John. So when you're in the EAR and the ITAR compliance area, right, you really have to follow the USML or the CCL lists. And if you have any of those articles that you're involved in, whether you're shipping them, transporting them, manufacturing them, making them, selling them, etc., acting as a distributor for them, you have to register with the State Department. For anything that is listed on the CCL, a license might be required for export, and it's going to depend on the destination country, the receiving party, end use, unless you've got an exclusion or an exemption. And if you've got an embargoed country, the license is going to be denied automatically. The ITAR also requires a license or exemption, and this kind of compliance can be problematic if you've got a global corporation, because data related to a specific type of technology may need to be transferred over the internet or stored locally outside the U.S. because of operational or other efficiency reasons. You may be contracting with someone for your cloud services, put some information out there, and you still need to be compliant. So the big concern here is going to be making sure, and we'll talk about it a little bit as we go through this, not only do you have to make sure you're compliant, but also anybody that you have contracted out any of these services. So let's go ahead and talk about exemptions. And you can self-certify for the exemption on both the EAR and the ITAR. And by claiming an exemption, you're basically self-certifying that your transaction meets all the criteria and you don't need to have a license. You have to make sure you read it carefully and that all the conditions apply. And you've got to report those exemptions annually to the DDTC. And you should document. That's probably one of the biggest things that we've gotten in terms of compliance programs and best practices, and talking to people and looking at the aftermath, because we also litigate and protect people on these issues. Is if you've documented the exemption through either shipping paperwork and bill of lading, or in conjunction with a log that you keep, or all three are is highly recommended. That's how you end up taking care of yourself. And on this slide on 21, we give a checklist of things that you should keep or make sure you're recording in an organized fashion. So if you do get hit by a regulator's inquiry, you're able to simply go, yeah, sure, we're all copacetic. We know exactly what we're doing, and here's our log and record that matches up with all of our shipping documents and bills of lading, which have the same info on it. And now licenses. Let's look at licenses. If you have to get a license because you don't have an exemption, the three things you should be asking about is, first, what are you exporting? Where are you sending it to? And with the what are you exporting, you also kind of have to think in the back of your head, so what is your item going to be used for? And then who's going to receive your item? And receive is the key there. It's not just who is necessarily on the bill of lading, etc. If you have reason to know that it's leaving the hands of somebody legitimate and going somewhere else, either because of its location or because of some other sort of trigger, you can't play dumb and say that you were compliant. Go ahead, John. So, John, why don't you take us through the licenses?
Sure. So it is possible to get licenses from OFAC in order to engage in transactions that otherwise would be prohibited. And there are two types of licenses. There's general licenses and specific licenses. The general license authorizes a particular type or class of transaction for a class of persons without the need to actually apply for the license. And then you've got what's called the specific license, which is used for dealing with a particular person or company, authorizing a specific transaction that comes in response to a written license application. And when we're talking about the general license, you do have to apply for the general license, but once you get it, you don't have to keep applying for each transaction. Whereas with the specific license, it's a per transaction license. And of course, you've got to make sure that all the conditions of the licenses are strictly observed. And you've got to be aware of what OFAC's regulations are, because there may be a specific requirement related to the particular type of transaction that you are trying to do. And so what is a prohibited transaction? And I mean, in its simplest form, it's a transaction that's either trade of goods or financial transaction, when I say goods or know-how, or other dealings in which U.S. persons may not engage unless they're authorized by OFAC or specifically exempted by a statute. And there's all different types of foreign policy, national security goals, which are ever changing as well. And so those prohibitions may vary between the different programs that are being administered by OFAC and the other departments. Raph, you want me to talk about the exceptions as well?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So, with respect to the general licenses, there's certain categories of documents and transactions that are allowed under those, and so you'll see exceptions to the requirements to have to go through OFAC in there. And again, with respect to the specific licenses, it's a case-by-case basis, and there is guidance in the federal code that shows you how to request a specific license. You can also ask certain professionals who will help you with that as well. Raf, do you want to talk about block funds?
Yeah, and one of the reasons we put in block funds is because this is something that obviously as credit professionals you're likely to run into. You may be trying to collect something, you may be working on something and then find out that the funds have been blocked, either yours or theirs because of a regulatory action. And you can apply for a specific license to release block funds. And there's an electronic application process. We've put the link in here for you folks to be able to kind of trace that back. And you can also submit an application for the release of block funds. And that's basically just, again, this is a regulatory regime. They're trying to, monitor and find tips of where bad activity is occurring. And they're going to flag certain things. And if you want to get unflagged, just get them the information, either by requesting a license with an application that way or submitting an application for the release of the block fund. Go to the next one, John. What you have to remember, though, is if you get denied by OFAC of the license application, that's a final agency action. It cannot be appealed. There's not a formal process of appeal, but if you can kind of say, hey, look, guys, and this is where a lot of times in administrative law, when you're dealing with regulators, it really has to do with how you deal or interface with the regulators. And that's why it's helpful to have a professional to do that. But even if it's something where you don't necessarily think you're going to need a professional because you're not trying to get yourself out of something, or you need an introduction by a professional to somebody, you need to establish a very good relationship with these regulators, because as you can see, there's no appeal process, but if you're nice and you have extra information that might help to sway or change something, they often allow for what's essentially an appeal, but they don't want to call it that, and they'll do a determination or reconsideration for good cause when you can show that things have changed or we have other information that the agency didn't get the first time around. Go to the next slide, John. Under BIS, you can get an export license as well. Most U.S. sourced items and some internationally sourced items that are considered dual use, as well as things that are purely commercial and purely munitions, are all subject to the EAR, as we talked about before. There's this thing called the Commerce Control List, which we're going to dig into a little deeper here, and that's organized what's called Export Control Classification Numbers, ECCN. That's going to be important for you guys. Every item specifically listed in the EAR has an assigned ECCN. Licenses are going to be required for the things we talked about before: national security, foreign policy, which can change dramatically over and over. Short supply of something, a commodity, etc., nuclear non-proliferation, missile tech, chemical and biological weapons, things that may contribute, if they're restricted, to regional stability, crime control, or anti-terrorism. Go to the next one, John. So let's go back to the question. What are you exporting? And this is where the ECCN comes in. So if your item's not listed on the Commerce Control, if your item's not listed on the Commerce Control List, then it's an EAR 99. And that's kind of the catch-all, okay? If your item falls under the jurisdiction of commerce, it'll get the EAR 99, but if not, the breakdown of the ECCN number is on here. So the first part is going to be the electronics category. The second part, the A, is going to be, what type of subcategory. And then the 001 is assigned to a particular product, right? And that's the breakdown of what an ECCN looks like. So if you plan to export something that's not specifically on the control list, and it becomes EAR 99, but it's supposed to go to an embargoed or sanctioned country or a party or where there's maybe prohibited end use, you may still be required to get a license. But if you don't fall on the list and you end up being in the catch-all of EAR 99, then you don't need to get a license just based on what the thing is. So go to the next one, John. The control list, this has got the categories. You can read them on your own, but that's the first part of the number. Go to the next one, John. And then the groups are the letter that comes after the number, and that that breaks down as it is right here. You go to the next one, John. And then these are some of the reasons for control that they might slap on to a determination. And again, I won't go through the individual pieces of it because you can kind of look at it and see what's there. But if you take a look at surreptitious listening, it shows you just how James Bond all this stuff is. Anything that they think might be used for spying, it pops up. That's another one of those things. Encryption items is something that a lot of people don't realize are out there. Some of the technology that's used to, say, put into an ATM or into even some of the card readers and phones and all that kind of stuff, that's not allowed to go to certain places where engineers can reverse engineer it and then use it for bad acts. Go to the next one, John. So then the next question is, we talked about what are you exporting now? The question is, where are you exporting? And this is really the sanctions program. This is, everyone's probably heard about this on the TV. One of the basic diplomatic and negotiating tools that the government has in foreign relations is sanctions. And U.S. sanctions programs vary in scope. They can be geographic. Some are targeted against certain things. Some may even be specific individuals and entities. Again, they can be broad, or they can be, as you guys are all watching the Netflix Narcos, I mean, it could be just about Pablo Escobar, or it could be about a particular terrorist. And whatever the issue is, the government has kind of broad strokes to be able to fashion a sanction against it. Go ahead, John. You can do the next one. You can kind of see here, this Venn diagram shows how these overlap as well. The United Nations have certain sanctions. European unions have certain sanction regimes. The United States has certain sanctions regimes, and some are shared. And you can see there's even a set of sanctions against the U.S. by the European Union. So, and you can see some of the things over here are either things like the rough diamond trade, or transnational criminal organizations, or Venezuela, cyber issues, and counter narcotics, or specific to countries like Cuba, or China, or Egypt. John, we can go to the next one. And there's a ton of different sanctions programs that OFAC administers. They don't maintain a specific list of countries that you can't do business with, so you kind of have to follow all the different programs. Go to the next one, John. And there's some good notice. There's some good links here for notice where you can sign up and get email notices pushed to you about different sanctions programs and when they change. And again, that changes with kind of the daily news and daily prerogatives of the President and the State Department. But these are good links to follow if you want to get stuff sent to you, either through an RSS feed or in some other fashion. And of course, there's services that aggregate this stuff for you as well. John, do the next one. We've also put in links here to specific country and other programs. So if you wanted to, you can kind of dig into that by going into these. You can see North Korea, Cuba, Iran, Russia-related sanctions for their encroachment into Ukraine, obviously Syria, counterterrorism, counter-narcotics. Those are some of the big, significant programs. Next slide. Now, the other piece to this is, well, who's getting your item, right? That's another big, it's not just where, but who's getting it, because sometimes they'll send it to a friendly place and then divert it. So, John, next one. So there are a list of people. They're individuals, companies that could be owned and controlled by or acting for or on behalf. They're surrogates for targeted countries. There's also individuals, groups, entities, terrorists, narcotics traffickers that are designated even if you don't have a country-specific sanction regime. Collectively, these people are called SDNs, specially designated nationals. Their assets are blocked, and U.S. persons are pretty much prohibited from having any sort of dealing with them. These are the people that, if you watch any of the cop or spy shows, when they're taking photos from far away, these are the people shaking hands with the other people they're going to go arrest. So, you have to be careful with anybody who's an SDN. Next slide. And we left, again, some of these slides we have put into place kind of to act as a reference point for you guys. But there's an entity list that BIS keeps. The EAR in the Office of Foreign Asset Control in Treasury has an SDN list. And then there's an unverified list, which is, these are folks where, you know what, they don't know everything about them, but they think they might require further look. And if you're on the unverified list, this is a red flag that you as an exporter have a duty to inquire about and do some due diligence before you export to them. There are also people who've been denied export or re-export transactions where export privileges have been denied. And those folks are also listed and available from BIS. Some of those people may be in the United States. They may be folks who have been prosecuted, have gotten out of jail, or have had their export licenses restricted, or who are foreign nationals living here and working here specifically for the purpose of setting up a distribution network. So, and again, these are things where if you know about this, you've got a requirement to report to the Office of Export Enforcement. Next. So what can you guys do? Because if you look at October 7th, 2015, just a snapshot of the SDN list, there are 15,200 entries, 155 countries, and there's a lot of folks in there that are for aircraft and ships and vessels, but the rest of them are designated individuals. So there are a lot of bad people out there, or at least people that have been caught. Next slide. Well, you can go to Treasury and run a check on those folks. Next one. And you can go to the unverified list and do a check there. And there's also a bunch of people that have been debarred for different convictions, and they're also listed. And then there's and that's easy enough. It gets a little more complicated. I'm going to let John run through these. It gets a little more complicated when you start to try to figure out, well, what if somebody's kind of hidden? It looks like a legitimate company, but somebody has an interest in one of these companies. Maybe they're controlling things from the background. How am I supposed to know that? And so, John, why don't you take us through when you have to kind of know who really owns a company?
Yeah, absolutely. But before I get to that, one thing, because we might be making you nervous about having to go through all these checklists, there are services out there that will do that for you. So when a purchase order comes in and you're running a conflict check, there are definitely services out there, or credit check, there are definitely services out there that will assist you in determining whether or not.
And you're right, John, you're right. There are services, but one thing I want everyone to be cautious about is, remember, you got to be careful who you're dealing with. And again, I wish I could say, hey, you don't really need a lawyer or any sort of service after you do this. I don't think we're trying to teach you guys to be export lawyers or compliance attorneys or compliance professionals in that sense. I think we're trying to make sure you guys have enough information so you know how this system works. Because you may not have the time, the energy, or resources to do some of this stuff, and you will want to farm it out. But remember, you've got an obligation to be smart about and know about this stuff, because you can also get nailed if your vendors or the folks you've trusted to look up things aren't doing it correctly. But John is right. There are folks that will come in and take some of this burden off you.
So in addition to having to deal with people that are on the SDN list, you also have to be concerned about who's behind the entity that you're dealing with. And so Treasury's got some guidelines on this, where if you've got somebody, or one or more people, who are on the SDN list that own, in the aggregate, 50% or more of a company, those entities are considered blocked, regardless of whether or not the entity is on the list or not. And this sort of comes back to the whole know your customer idea. And this guidance is revised from earlier guidance. And to give you an idea of what the 50% ownership rule is now, it only talks about ownership and not control. And so an entity that's controlled by somebody who's on the blocked persons list, but is not owned 50% or more in the aggregate by that person, is not automatically considered to be blocked pursuant to the rule, although it is possible that OFAC might designate the entity and add it to the list. So one thing that OFAC urges is caution when dealing with an entity that may not at that time be 50% controlled or 50% owned by one or more blocked people, but because ownership interest can change and is fluid, while it might not be 50% owned today, it might be 50% owned tomorrow, and then all of a sudden it's considered blocked. And so it's always possible that that entity might land on the that blocked list. And there are certain sanctions programs, including Cuba and Sudan, where they block people that even don't have a OFAC designation, and those blocked people are blocked based on criteria that's different from the 50% ownership rule. And so you've got to be cautious when you're entering into dealings with certain companies where you don't know who's behind it, because you might be entering into a contract that gets signed by a blocked person, and that can create all sorts of issues. The other important thing to note about the 50% ownership rule is it's in aggregate. And so you can have it where person X owns 25% of an entity, and that person's blocked, and you've got a second blocked person who also owns 25%. That entity is considered blocked because there's 50% or more of that entity is owned by blocked people. And this is also true when you're talking about entities that are owned by blocked people that might own a portion of an entity, of a separate entity. And so that's something that you've got to be careful with as well. And so it's really important to know. Go ahead, Ralph.
John, I think we should do, let's do kind of the highlights, just like you did really well on those last couple slides, for the rest of the blocked persons. And then, since we're getting towards the end of this, I think go into what's deemed an export and all that as well. So give them the highlights, and then we'll move on to the next.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, just very, very quickly. It's important that you can't engage in negotiations or enter into contracts or process transactions involving blocked individuals, even when that blocked individual is acting on behalf of a non-blocked entity that person controls. And I guess we'll move on. Then there's also the indirect ownership rule, which again, that's where we're talking about when we're talking about going through some entity that's not directly owned. And then with divestiture, you know, that can make what was a blocked entity no longer a blocked entity if it falls below the 50% threshold. And again, I guess OFAC urges caution because, again, the ownership percentages can change. Sometimes it'll fall below, but then, you know, that person will acquire more of an interest and then it goes right back up. So you just got to do your due diligence. You know, the same thing applies to wire transfers, and this can be an issue, right, where you don't want you don't want to ship the goods and then have the funds transferred, but then have OFAC block them. So it's really something that's important to know when you're dealing with these entities, who controls them, and what that ownership structure is like. All right, so let's move on to when something's deemed an export.
Yeah, this is the tricky one because some of you may be sitting back and saying, "Hey, look, I don't export. My stuff's just here." And one of the reasons why all this is important is that, you know, you could end up having a deemed export because you've released technology to foreign persons that are in the U.S. And you don't have to have anyone be outside of the United States. Deemed export licenses are often universities, high-tech research and development institutions, biochemical firms, the medical and computer sectors, and that's where you've got, again, you've got technology that you pass along to someone in the U.S. as a foreign national. You're not even exporting, but it could be deemed an export, and you need to have a license for that because that's a restricted transfer. There are exceptions to that. If you've got someone who's got permanent residence here through a green card, if they've been granted U.S. citizenship, or if they're a protected person, and we're talking about, you know, a lot of people in here that you know, would be tourists, students, business people, etc. All those folks may not be subject to this. Next slide. And again, protected persons, what they mean by that are people that are political refugees, political asylum holders. There are different folks that are excluded from this. Go back to that for a second, John. The problem is that even though the deemed export regulations can be triggered, that doesn't necessarily mean that a license is required, because you may have something that's EAR 99, or there could be an exception on top of that. But you do have to always remember, you know, who it's going to, and what it is, and where it's going to. Those are always there, and if you may not be subject to a license requirement for one, but then get hit by another. Okay, go to the next one, John. So monitoring, this is the other big thing here. So as I said before, the private sector, the U.S. government's taking the position that, you know, you guys are part of the line of defense in protecting national security. And this allows the industry to help with compliance and also to help prevent violations. Because with some of the issues we have here, the violations aren't just a money issue or getting around some regulation or whatever. These are hardcore national security issues. And effective compliance programs will help detect violations and make voluntary disclosures that significantly mitigate penalties. That's the key here. Is in almost this, and it's very similar to cyber law in terms of regulation. You want to prevent attacks, whether they're virtual or real, in real time, real space. And you don't want someone to say, hey, I don't want to go tell anybody what I've seen because I think it'll implicate me. So if you make voluntary disclosures, okay, more than likely they're not going to hold it against you, and or the penalties are going to be minimal. If you don't, you're going to get crushed, as John showed early on. But they want to really encourage people to help detect the violations. And another key point here is if your company acquires another company, you're going to be held liable for any violations of the company that you bought. So you have to make sure you look at that when you're doing the due diligence. Go ahead, John. You can take us through this one.
Sure. So the BIS has a compliance strategy that they talk about where they, like I said, they rely on the due diligence of exporters to help ensure national security. And so they want exporters to develop an export management and compliance program. And although such a program is not going to guarantee that there won't be a violation, it helps minimize the risk that there will be one. And it also shows that the company, as long as they're complying with that program, is doing something to help lower the risk. And so if there is in fact a sanction, something that takes place, it'll help reduce any potential sanctions that might come around. And so, it's important when you have your compliance program that all employees have a copy of the statement so they know the seriousness of what is going on. And we talked about the potential penalties earlier on. And then when you're developing your compliance program, it's important to identify the vulnerabilities and try to eliminate as best you can the risk of the violations. And so on this slide, we've gone through a couple of steps that will help you do that. One of them is to chart your order flow from when you receive the request through to when those goods or services are shipped and delivered, and to document that. We talked a little bit earlier about how it's important to know your customer in this, and we'll talk about in a little bit some of the red flags that might show up when you're going through this. It's also important to develop a narrative that helps describe the movement of the request to see if the request changes throughout the whole process, as well as to identify where in the whole chain of things there might be a risk of violations occurring, such as certain things taking place overseas where you have less of an ability to monitor what's really going on. And then again, it's also important to check the process from time to time to make sure that it is in fact working as intended. It's important too to establish stop, hold, and cancel criteria to prevent transactions from moving forward when it does turn out that there is something that creates a red flag or is an issue, as well as to include instructions to let people know what happens when those checks actually fail, and also to establish release criteria for shipments that have been stopped but have now been deemed to allow to continue. And then we've got a slide here that discusses some of the possible business vulnerabilities. Just a few, because we're running short on time, is you need to be aware of your product's dual use risks. Even though something might not seem like it is a potential for a dual risk issue, it can be, so that's something that needs to be checked. You need to know your business partners who you're dealing with throughout the export process and make sure that there are clear roles and that you know where the product is going, who that end user is. It's important to, again, screen.
John, one of the ones I like is the spare parts, right? Because so the way the bad guys sometimes get things is they ask for parts that they can then work into something nefarious somewhere else. So you have to be careful when you've got spare parts or you do components of things. You got to be careful if somebody starts to ask for those things when you know that maybe they don't have the end product.
Right, and it's important to note too, right? If you're dealing with a company that says, right, we need 1 million widgets, but they're a very small company that wouldn't have the capacity for those to use all of those widgets, it's important to follow up and ask why it is that they want those, that amount.
Let's jump to slide 70, John.
Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Right. So as we talked about before, there are certain vendors that you can use to help ensure compliance with OFAC. Credit bureaus and agencies are big ones, but there's plenty of others out there as well. And they will screen to make sure that you're compliant. And even if they mess up in that screening process, it shows an effort by you guys to comply with the OFAC regulations. So that also helps mitigate your risk. And Raph, do you want to take this over?
Yeah, so when you're you need to look on the credit report, and sometimes there may be a red flag or an alert. That doesn't mean that someone is doing something wrong, but it just means that you should now conduct some due diligence by going in and checking this. So again, in addition to having, say, a private service, if you do a lot of exports, just doing the regular credit monitoring that you do should result in at least some tips of when you need to then follow up and go to those OFAC lists that we've laid out here and see if there's something off. Let's go to the next one. And look, we included on page 72, and then let's go to the next one. These are just some screening methods that the BIS has said, hey, run these things. These are suggested practices. We don't have to go into those in detail, but there is a good resource. And go to the next slide. So one of the things that you really need to do, and we'll run through the last couple of slides, but this is important, is that a well-documented customer file that's got everything in there, which is real similar to what you guys do as credit managers anyway when you keep a credit file. These are the things that help in your compliance. And, they're going to come to you guys during the credit, because a lot of this stuff's going to happen when you do credit checks, whether that happens through a pre-approved form that your sales guys have, or whether it happens on an ongoing basis. If there's an issue that pops up in regard to this type of compliance, you guys may very likely be the person that your CFO or your compliance officer turns to say, okay, we got this request from a regulator, where's the file? And you need to update that file whenever you get new information on the customer. And any sort of risk of diversion of things, that would also be a big piece of information that you should really have in your file. And you should always screen new customers. Go to the next one, John. These are a good set of red flags. We mentioned a couple of them before, and I think that they're good to quickly go through. If you have somebody who is evasive and doesn't tell you what they're going to use this thing for, do you have orders that are inconsistent with the needs of the purchaser? Do you have something that's incompatible, say, for example, with the 120 volts versus 220 volts? The other thing that could happen here is, have you looked as to whether or not there's any potential military use here? Go to the next one, John. We'll kind of try to wrap up. Is it suitable to improve existing equipment or plants for military use? Do you have all kinds of excessive safety or security measures in light of the nature of the equipment because it looks like it may be going somewhere else afterwards? And is it somewhere near someplace with strict security control or near military facilities? You got to watch out for vague dates, out of way, freight forwarding firms or the ultimate destination, so it's going somewhere else. Abnormal shipping routes where things fall off of trucks in strange places. Is it the wrong type of packaging for that type of location? And is there anything, like, do they tell you this? I love this one. Are there unusual requests for labeling or shipping of the goods, particularly the labeling part? But these are all, like I said, good things to look at. So, John, next one. Another good one here. Do you have a partially finished product? Again, that issue of the parts and pieces. And you know, I think that if you get someone that says, I don't want a performance guarantee, a warranty, or service, then it may also be something they're just pulling apart for some required piece of it that can be used for a nefarious action. Next one, John. That's it. So we went a little bit over, but I wanted to get some of those out there, and obviously you'll have the presentation to look at. So I don't know if there's any questions that you guys have.
Yes, there's one question I'd like to pose from one of our members out there. They wrote, who are some of the largest service providers for running a check on an entity to whom we want to sell?
You know, that's something where we haven't researched some of the larger ones of those. We can certainly take a look, but because there's so much liability involved from y'all's, I mean, they won't come to ask us, but from the credit manager or the company's perspective as to who their vendor is, I think that this presentation will help ask the right questions on that. But we can certainly take a look and get some recommendations from folks that are best practices. But you know, we normally rely on the credit bureaus to do some of that. So one of the things you may want to do is talk to your current vendors who do a lot of where you get your credit reports, and see if they provide the same service. And if you trust the way they do things, it makes your due diligence process a little bit easier.
Okay, there are no other questions at this time. I will provide Jonathan and Raphael's email when I send the PDF version of the presentation later today, and they can follow up directly.
Yep, we're always available for you guys.
Okay, with that said, we are going to close today's webinar. I would like to thank Raphael and Jonathan for taking the time to present to our group today, and thank all of today's attendees for taking time out of their day to join us. Thank you all again, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.